Cairo, Egypt, 1325. On the outskirts of town, a massive caravan of unknown travelers approached the city, numbering roughly 60,000. Incorporated within the caravan were soldiers, slaves, griots or musicians, 100 elephants, and 80 cows. This was during the time of the Hajj, the yearly gathering of Muslims to Mecca and one of the 5 pillars of Islam. The Hajj was and is an obligation of each and every Muslim, which required a believer to make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. This was in order to worship, commune, and participate in Islamic rituals for a week. Normally, this pilgrimage is more of a humble undertaking, and in 1325, the majority of the pilgrims were of meager means. This was not the case for this caravan. Each slave carried at least 3 kilos of gold, amounting to about $150,000 in today's money. Each man, woman, and animal displayed silken garments, among many of the most expensive accoutrements that money could buy. And the leader of this caravan wanted it to be known that he and he alone was the leader of this opulent display. His name was Mansa Musa I, ruler of the Mali Empire to the west. To say that he was rich would almost be disrespectful. In fact, to this day, Mansa Musa, with an estimated worth of $400 billion, was the richest man ever to grace this earth. But how did he get here? What type of man was he? And most importantly, for the sake of today's episode, what happened to all of that money? Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, episode 13. Thank you for joining us. In this week's episode, I want to hover over the topic of worth. Not necessarily in the traditional or literal sense, but somewhere in between. Personally, I believe that one's worth is not necessarily established based on what someone has or doesn't have, but more about the life that is lived. Keeping that in mind, I was somewhat astounded by the fact that the story of Mansa Musa isn't necessarily well known. In preparation for today's episode, I asked a few people if they had ever heard of him, and the answer was a resounding no or a possible maybe. I think that in a more modern scope, people have a tendency to imagine the past as some dust-ridden, often archaic savagery that doesn't compare to our present way of life. But in the case of Mansa Musa, I truly beg to differ. To begin, Mansa Musa was born in the year 1280 within the Mali Empire. At the time of his birth, he and his family were handed down rulership through his great-uncle Siddia Keita. Siddia had made a regional name for himself by creating a sort of union between the surrounding rulers with himself at the helm. At the time, this was quite a feat. Most rulers and nations survived independently and used their resources and people as they saw fit. But it was due to those resources that Siddia convinced the surrounding nations of their combined might. And with that, the Mali Empire was born. After Siddia's death, Musa's brother Mansa Abu Bakr II was crowned ruler. And with that responsibility handed him by Siddia, Abu Bakr wanted to expand the empire west, beyond the Atlantic, and beyond the imagination of anyone within the empire. It was with the thought of expansion that Abu, flanked by 2,000 ships, ventured off into the Atlantic in order to see what lay beyond their known boundaries. His younger brother, Musa, was given the title of regent or deputy until his return. Days passed, then weeks, and then months. Throughout the empire, rumblings began to swell, and most of them assumed that either one of two things had happened. Either Abu had discovered some far-off land filled with delights and treasures they could only dream of, or he and his 2,000 ships had met a watery death. Musa agreed with the latter and was coronated emperor, or Mansa, of the Mali Empire by force of his position as regent. Over the next 10 years, Musa began a relentless expansion campaign along with 100,000 soldiers. After 10 years had passed, the Mali Empire covered an area roughly twice the size of France, containing portions of modern-day Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and the Gambia. And all of these were contained within 14 provinces. Like his great uncle before him, Musa allowed the nations to continue with their culture, their language, their traditions. But what was required was their fealty along with all of their gold. Now, gold combined with what seemed to be a never-ending supply of salt created a somewhat renaissance along the empire. Musa began to erect mosques and universities throughout. Travelers would comment about the safety they experienced due to the strict punishments for crime, and at a time when Europe was experiencing poverty and savagery, the Mali people were well-fed, healthy, intelligent, and relatively happy by comparison. Regionally, Musa's fame was apparent. His empire was prosperous. The gold trade stretched as far north as Venice, and he was loved. However, east, no one knew of the mighty Mali Empire. There had certainly been rumors passed through the mouths of merchants and traders, but the full extent of Musa's wealth hadn't been experienced on a continental level. That all changed in 1324, when Musa, along with 60,000 men and roughly 2,000 animals and an assortment of slaves, made the 2-year Hajj to Mecca. Along the way, the militarized caravan conquered a few smaller nations, as well as freely donated gold dust to passers-by on a whim. By the time Musa arrived in Cairo, the townspeople were aghast by the sheer size of the Mali, along with the fact that each and every member of the caravan seemed to shimmer with gold and various displays of wealth. Upon arriving in Cairo, Musa gifted the Sultan al-Malik al-Nasir with an estimated 210 kilos of gold and stayed in the city for the next few days. I don't want to skip over the fact that in today's money, 1 kilo of gold is approximately $50,000. Musa gave 210 as a gift. During their 3-day stay, Musa and his men handed out gold nuggets and dust to the citizens, and even though the local merchants tried to increase the cost of goods for the visitors from the west, they paid with ease without a second thought. To further emphasize the amount of money spent and or given away, by the time Musa and crew left Cairo, they created an inflation event so strong that the entire Egyptian economy took 12 years to recover. After all, supply and demand is a real thing, and if everyone has gold, it isn't worth that much anymore. After the completion of the Hajj, the caravan returned to Mali, absorbing Timbuktu along the way. Over the next 10 years or so, Musa invested in infrastructure and education, paying millions for universities and more mosques. It was rumored that at his peak, Musa commissioned the building of mosques every Friday, at least one mosque per Friday. To this day, and pardon my pronouncement, the Jin Gruber Mosque and the Sankore Madrasa still can be visited if you ever find yourself in Timbuktu, that is. An interesting fact that I didn't know, the Sankore Madrasa was once the holder of a vast library of up to 1 million scrolls. This would have made it the second largest library ever to exist, number 1 being the famed Library of Alexandria, which was burned by Julius Caesar and later decimated over time. Until his death in 1337, Mansa Musa was known as a strong but fair ruler with zero tolerance for crime and disrespect. After his death, his son Mansa Magan took over rulership. But like most things handed down, there's a certain amount of respect that's lost when transferred. Over the next 200 years, most of Musa's fortune had been squandered due to war and bad decisions, and the empire began to shrink, mostly by the hands of surrounding nations that sort of seized the opportunity to free themselves from the eyes of Musa's not-so-wise progeny. Overall, the idea of wealth is something that we've all fantasized about, I believe. The travel, the spending, the legacy of it all, but Musa was forward-thinking. Most, if not all, of his exorbitant spending was like a mini commercial, which kept the eyes of the viewer fixated on the strength and ingenuity of West Africa. I have my suspicions as to why the story of Mansa Musa I has somewhat been ushered into the shadows of history. The idea of the richest man that ever lived being located at a place and time when the rest of the world seemed to be wallowing in peasantry and superstition kind of goes against the common narrative. Poverty, war, and distended bellies are a much more convenient lie to propagate, especially to the masses, when the alternative is tales of dominance and self-determination. But I digress. We'll be right back. Welcome back. In the second half of today's episode, we're going to continue with the idea of worth. And like always, we have a short story, which I hope sort of intertwines the theme. Having said all that, I'm going to, as always, try to skip the preamble and get right to the story. Now, today's story goes by the name The Bones of Gennaro Bick. We begin. The people of the land of Nebu were poor. The only thing that brought sustenance to the village was the summer harvest, and due to the intense heat, only a few crops managed not to perish. A day's work was arduous and filled with the monotony of repetition. At the end of the day, the women would gather the crops and prepare them for the men who would carry them into the city for sale, hopefully to return with goods and enough money to sustain them through the blistering winter. Some of the men were lazy. Gennaro Bick was elite in that regard. He hated the constant toiling in the fields and the smell of the pasture, and by now the sight of his own family started to become a nuisance to him. Not that he didn't love them, but because they were a constant reminder of his lack of choice, or at least the absence of it. Knowing all of these things, Gennaro relented to the predicament of responsibility and accepted his role amongst the villagers. Begrudged, he awakened to the continuous cackle of roosters and whining dogs, kissed his wife and children, and before the sun began to crest over the sleepy village, he headed south to Paranang to sell corn. Not because he wanted to, but because, as it so happened to be, it was his turn. There had been times that he avoided this duty. Usually, an illness was a way out, faked or exaggerated. But as a Nebu man, there were only so many times that this responsibility could be shirked before he and his family would be excommunicated or even killed. It had been months since his last trip to Paranang, and judging by the whispers and the increasing lack of eye contact he and his family were starting to receive from the villagers, Gennaro understood that he was one more resignation away from a stone to the head or a cave-dwelling winter. Along the journey, Gennaro fantasized about a new life. He would often see the palaces of the rich in the distance, the manicured lawns, fine carriages, and joyful offspring. Sporadically, he would cross paths with servants as they headed to and fro from one rich tyrant's home to the next. Gennaro would look into their eyes and see the same emotion that welled within his heart: defeat. Not defeat from having to be one's servant. It was a good living, and it did provide for the families of his elders for hundreds of years. Indeed, it was not that form of defeat. Gennaro, he saw the defeat that came from a life misspent, a life hidden beneath the shadows of the powerful, a life of perpetual servitude with no means of escape, a life which somehow he was born into and handed down to his children as a shameful inheritance, whether he wanted to or not. After the days-long journey, Gennaro arrived in Penang in enough time to settle in for the night. He made a small tent, a small fire, and settled himself at a distance away from the other merchants. As he slept, he dreamt a most elaborate dream. In it, he himself was the master of a large manor. Servants moved about, catering to his every wish and need. Women of all nations rested at his feet, and in his hand he held a letter. The letter was old and ragged. When he opened it, he saw that all the words were written in smeared blood. He could not decipher what it said, but he did manage to see one word, a word that seemed to excite him. This word was greed. Daybreak came, and like the other merchants, Gennaro had prepared his wares in Penang Square. Many people came that day, so much so that Gennaro had sold all of his goods by midday. He smiled upon his good fortune as he counted his money. It truly was a good day. In his hand he possessed 600 kafir, more than enough to sustain his village well into the spring. With that in mind, he decided to take a small portion out and purchase a drink at the local tavern, keeping the rest in a leather pouch fastened to his side. The tavern was filled with every manner of men, some of a nefarious nature. Most of them were peasants like him, but in the corners, draped in shadow and too much liquor, lay the miscreants, swindlers, and murderers. For some reason, they huddled together, spirits akin, eyeing any and everyone, searching for any sign of weakness amongst the crowd. Knowing full well their intent, Gennaro thought to himself, "I will have one drink and head to my village. I know of these men, and I will not be taken as a fool." No sooner than the time it took for those thoughts to enter and settle in his mind, he turned to find one of the scoundrels sitting next to him. The man introduced himself as Ivory Kane, a merchant just like him, from the eastern plains. Gennaro shook his hand, keen to notice the texture of it. They were not the hands of a field worker. They were soft, even with the soot that festered around his palms and underneath his nails. Nevertheless, Gennaro greeted Ivory with a half smile and continued with his drink. Ivory, slighted by Gennaro's gesture, asked him his name. Gennaro explained that it was not important, but out of pure conversation, he formally introduced himself. Ivory smiled and commented on his unusual name. He asked, "Where's your home? Is it in Hunar or Yakodim?" Gennaro told him of his home in Nibu, the mountainous valleys, and the roaring rapids of the south. A reminiscent grin crept upon his face, and Gennaro sat in silence, thinking fondly of his village and the people therein. Ivory asked, "Your smile speaks of love, the kind that has escaped my heart since my youth, but your eyes fight against you. You long for more, correct? You want to see more than your homeland. You have the face of a king, yet you squander your youth in the fields under the hot sun for a few pieces of silver and gold. Please, tell me of your aspirations. My time of dreaming is behind me, and I love to indulge in the imaginations of others." Sorrow fell upon Gennaro. He knew the stranger's words were true, yet he also knew he had a role to play in his village, whether he wanted to or not. For hours, Gennaro and Ivory talked like old companions until Gennaro considered the time. Abruptly, Gennaro stood to his feet, shook the hand of Ivory Kane, and headed towards the tavern door. Before he could leave, Ivory approached him, wished him a safe journey, and whispered in his ear, saying, "All that you can and should be depends on the strength of your will. Your passion for greatness will carry you far. Only remember that passion is not a burden, but a gift, and if unfulfilled, it will become a noose that will surely kill you." With those words, the two strangers reciprocated a strong embrace, and Gennaro left the tavern and started the extensive journey home. The night was unlike the day. Gennaro always felt that it could be sensed within the soul. The darkness was not comforting, nor was it disturbing. It was simply everything that the day could never be. In it was the acceptance of the progression of life. But in Gennaro's mind, it was also another step into the ordinary. As depression began to overtake him, he saw an odd sight ahead. In the distance, what seemed to be a small mass lied on the ground. Gennaro assumed it was shrubbery from a tree or something that had fell from a passing carriage, or maybe an animal that had succumbed to a deadly wound. But as he came closer, he saw that it was the body of a dead man. Immediately, Gennaro began to search the man for anything that would reveal his identity, to no avail. Deciding that the man was probably some wanderer who had fallen dead due to hunger or some unknown force, he stood to his feet to leave him, but as he took his first step away from the corpse, he noticed that in his hand was a crumpled letter. Gennaro unfurled the letter and read its contents. "To whomever finds this letter, I am a man that has searched the earth for his calling. Long had my joy been submerged in the sadness that was my life. I have written this letter so that I may be of service to whomever happens to come across my words. Please read carefully, for I offer the key to happiness and everything that your heart desires. My name is of no consequence, and my past my own. My purpose is to share with you the secret of my success. His name is Kassan Rin, a warlock that dwells in the land of Gurleen in the hidden forest. If you find him, he will instruct you in all things concerning your life and the path in which you should take. He is a poor man, but he does not give his guidance for free. His fee is 500 kafar, but I assure you that you will in turn reap 100-fold from his insight. If you do find him, tell him that you found this letter, and he will unveil your future. Do not dismiss this as the ramblings of a crook. Do not turn away from your destiny. Trust in this letter as you trust in the light of the sun to illuminate your path. This is your day." Gennaro searched himself for an answer that would appease his soul. He reasoned with himself, saying, "If I hurry to Gurleen and meet with this Kassan, I will have doubled my money and return home with riches beyond my greatest imagination. But if I am wrong, I will be an outcast, and I would rather be dead than to carry the burden of losing the money which my village had been so dependent on." Trying to gather his thoughts, Gennaro reached into his pouch to find that all of the money that he had earned was missing. Not even a single piece of silver remained. He searched the ground like a madman, backtracked all of his steps, but the money was gone. In an instant, he realized that by allowing Ivory to embrace him, he had given him the opportunity to pick his pocket. Gennaro screamed into the night, cursing Ivory Kane with a trembling groan, but in the end, it was he who had failed his test. Ivory fulfilled his purpose of distraction, while Gennaro was overtaken by drunkenness and not aware enough to thwart his trickery. Gennaro sat next to the corpse and wept. His tears were heavy, and his lament was like that of a mother who had lost her child due to some great plague or by the wind of a ferocious storm. This was because he knew that by losing the money, he had in turn allowed death into the very gates of his village. Only in his case, his foolishness had welcomed it. Suicide seemed to be the only solution to his shame. He figured that if he threw himself off of a cliff, his death would be considered an accident, and his children would not be scorned as the descendants of a fool. He considered his wife for a moment, but he became comforted in the fact that she was a woman of tremendous beauty and would easily remarry. Gennaro found peace in his decision, so he stood to his feet and began to walk to the cliffs. But before he could take a full stride, his foot happened to strike the back of the dead man. The clanking of silver rang into the night. Gennaro began to search the man again until finally he arrived at a small leather pouch hidden at his side that contained exactly 500 kafar, all in gold. Gennaro thanked the god of his faith for his great fortune, and with tears of gratefulness, he began to journey home. Walking through the dark of night, Gennaro thought of the darkness which was his life, his unfulfilled dreams, and the cyclical existence that ate at his heart, urging him to seek more. The closer he came to Nebu, the closer he began to hold the dead man's letter to his chest. For a brief moment, he reconsidered returning to his village. Surely, he thought, the money that I possess could very well be the salvation of my village, but what if it was meant to be my own salvation? What if it is an omen that I have blindly ignored to fulfill my duties as a man in my village? Taking a deep, cleansing breath, Gennaro read the letter again, this time more intently, and by the time he had finished the last phrase, his decision was made. He would seek the man named Kassan and head into the forest of Gerline. "This is my day," he said aloud. The road to Gerline was a treacherous one. The night hid the visage of many creatures that crept in the bushes and shadows. Gennaro fought his fear and continued forward, comforting himself with thoughts of riches and success. In time, I will send for my family, and they will forgive my abandoning them, he thought. To survive, Gennaro ate many of the grubs and animals he met along the way. In his mind, he pretended that it was some unique cuisine from some far-off land, much like the food he would consume in his palace. The urge to succeed was so strong that he did not notice the passing of the hours or even the passage of days as they easily slipped away. Gennaro had struggled through the canyons of Hunan, the seas of Mecca, and even the dark forest of the Yarobi, but still he had not reached Gerline. Weeks passed, and Gennaro was now wearing a full beard, and his clothing was the epitome of filth, but in his eyes there was a pride not known to any of his village. This pride came from the opiate of fantasy, the intoxicant of myth. He knew within himself that Gerline could not be far, so during the drudgery of each step, he maintained his sanity, safe in the fact that he was now unique, for he had taken control over his life, and the meeting of Kassan would be an additive to the joy he had already realized within himself. From prior knowledge, Gennaro knew that the hidden forest of Gerline was northwest, just kilometers past the swamplands of Bentar and Vernova. So when he finally reached the swamp, he fell to his knees and thanked the gods for safe passage. From then, he made his way through Vernova until he arrived at a spacious clearance which overlooked what appeared to be clusters of never-ending sand dunes. Confused, Gennaro searched in all directions for the forest, but it was nowhere to be found. "This must be my last obstacle," he said to himself. "I will swiftly traverse through this desert and meet with my fate. Thank God for determination." The desert was not an easy task. Gennaro did not bring any provision from his travels, and he was without water. He carefully crossed the burning sands, careful not to overexert himself in the hot sun. To comfort himself, he took out the letter he had found on the journey from Paranang, Over and over he read its text, keeping himself entertained with thoughts of the life to come. Suddenly, an eerie thought seeped into his mind. How do you know that the stranger you found with the letter is the same man that wrote it? What if he too indulged in the same journey as you, only to perish alone in the fields of Paranang? This thought immediately began to rob Gennaro of his joy and determination. Suddenly the sun seemed heavy, and even the heat seemed to increase. The sands below became razors, cutting and gnawing at his feet relentlessly. He began to feel his hunger pangs, and the thirst that he had so easily discounted had begun to punish his body. His steps became slower, labored. For the first time, his heart began to break. Tears began to flow from his eyes like the sweat that poured from his pores in the fields of Nibu. Slowly, Gennaro began to surrender to the torture of his mind, body, and soul, whether he wanted to or not. Collapsing in the hot sun, listening as his breath became more sparse and difficult, thoughts of his wife and children, the village, the dutiful repetition he had so stridently detested, all seemed quaint and overflowing with a nostalgic beauty. Finally, overcome with the stench of travel and shame, Gennaro took his last breath, uttering the word that was shown to him in his dream. Greed. Many years later, a traveling peasant roamed the desert on camelback. Under a scorching sun, he came upon a mound of sand with a sliver of clothing peeking through the grains. When he began to search through it, he noticed that the clothing covered a skeleton of a man. He noticed that in the hands of the skeleton was a letter, and attached to the bones was a leather pouch. After opening the pouch, he saw that the pouch contained 500 kafar, more than enough to sustain him in his travels. Believing that he had found some poor soul that had wandered into the desert, he decided to read the letter. After reading it, his face became aglow with hope. His heart began to sing with the promises of a new day free of strife and poverty. As he mounted his camel, he spoke within himself, saying, I will find this Kassan Rin, and I too will become one of the rich and powerful. With that, the peasant traveler headed in the direction that he believed to be Gerline, clutching the pouch and the letter taken from the skeletonized body of Gennaro Bick. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for joining me on the 13th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. I would like to say thank you for the people that are listening to this podcast in sort of diverse places. People that are listening in Germany, people that are listening in Oregon and Alabama and Memphis and wherever you may be. I truly do appreciate it, and I hope to, as I say, not get good, but get better. As always, you can reach me at swtomail@gmail.com. Again, that is swtomail@gmail.com. And that's it, guys. That's the end of today's episode about worth, whether that is a monetary worth or just a worth that you see within yourself. As always, I'll see you guys in about 2 weeks. And be mindful of the stories you tell yourself. As always, thank you for giving me your time. I truly appreciate it.